In the skeletal months following the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany, the world's political architecture underwent a seismic realignment that few in positions of power genuinely understood. May 1945 marked not the conclusion of conflict, but rather the opening of an entirely new theater, one where the victors' masks began to slip, revealing the true architecture of geopolitical calculation beneath the carefully constructed narratives of moral clarity. General George Smith Patton, Jr., the man who had orchestrated some of the most brutal and decisive military maneuvers of the European campaign, found himself facing an adversary far more cunning than any Wehrmacht general he had confronted: the machinery of institutional consensus and the suffocating gravity of political inevitability. To understand Patton's trajectory into obsolescence, one must first abandon the comfortable mythology that surrounds him. He was not merely a warrior poet, a caricature of aggressive military genius bound by Hollywood's interpretive frameworks. Rather, Patton was a thinking man, perhaps dangerously so, who had spent decades studying the patterns of history, the mechanics of power, and the psychology of conflict. His extensive journals reveal a mind consumed by classical military theory, by the cyclical nature of empires, and by an almost prophetic understanding of how nations decay from within. What separated Patton from the political machinery that would eventually consume him was precisely this: he believed that military judgment derived from empirical observation and historical precedent should carry weight in matters of state strategy. The problem, however, was not that Patton was necessarily correct in his assessments, though evidence would later suggest he possessed remarkable foresight regarding Soviet intentions. The genuine catastrophe was that he believed his correctness mattered. He believed that facts, when clearly articulated by someone with both the authority and credibility of high military command, could penetrate the fog of ideological commitment and institutional inertia. This was his fatal miscalculation. In the immediate post-war environment, the American political and diplomatic establishment had already made its fundamental choice. The Soviet Union, despite being a communist dictatorship whose internal apparatus rivaled Nazi Germany in its brutality, would be treated as a legitimate partner in the post-war order. This was not a matter of debate. It was settled doctrine, defended with almost religious fervor by the State Department, by certain factions within the military hierarchy, and most critically, by the immediate circle surrounding President Harry Truman. Patton's analysis of the Soviet Union was rooted in something far more primitive and therefore more dangerous to the establishment: observation. He had not yet arrived at his conclusions through ideological conviction. He came to them through the simple act of paying attention to what Soviet forces were actually doing in Eastern Europe. He witnessed firsthand the mechanisms of Soviet occupation. He observed how Soviet military administrators methodically dismantled existing administrative structures, eliminated educated classes, and installed puppet governments loyal to Moscow. He noted how millions of Soviet soldiers were not celebrating the end of fascism, but rather beginning the methodical conquest of territories that Stalin had explicitly claimed as within the Soviet sphere of influence. What Patton recognized with an almost unbearable clarity was that the war against Nazi totalitarianism had merely been replaced by a war against Soviet totalitarianism, and that his own government was effectively ceding the Eastern European territories to this new master. The framework of power that would eventually destroy Patton was not built upon arguments or counter-arguments. It was built upon something far more immutable: consensus. The decision had been made at the highest levels that Soviet cooperation was essential for maintaining post-war stability, for managing the atomic question, and for preventing another devastating continental conflict. Patton's observations, no matter how accurate, were therefore not merely wrong, they were insubordinate. They challenged not a particular policy, but rather the entire foundational consensus upon which post-war planning rested. More dangerously still, Patton possessed both the rank and the platform to articulate these observations with sufficient authority to potentially influence public opinion and military thinking. What emerges from the historical record is a portrait of a man whose greatest asset, his unflinching clarity of vision, became the mechanism of his destruction. Patton had spent a lifetime cultivating the warrior's virtue of seeing situations as they actually were, rather than as they were wished to be.
This capacity had made him an extraordinary military commander. But in the political arena of post-war America, where consensus mattered infinitely more than accuracy, where institutional loyalty superseded factual analysis, and where the entire post-war order depended upon Americans accepting a fundamentally contradictory narrative that the Soviet Union was both communist and trustworthy, both totalitarian and a legitimate partner for peace, Patton's refusal to accept comfortable lies became his death sentence. The machinery was already in motion. What remained was merely the bureaucratic execution of a predetermined outcome.
The machinery of institutional suppression does not typically operate through dramatic declarations or explicit prohibitions. Instead, it functions through a system of graduated pressure, calculated humiliations, and the strategic deployment of ambiguity. Patton would discover this reality through a series of escalating confrontations that began not in the halls of power, but in the minutiae of daily command and control. By the summer of 1945, his observations regarding Soviet intentions had evolved from private journal entries into public statements made to journalists, fellow officers, and increasingly to any audience that would listen. What Patton failed to understand, or perhaps understood too late, was that in the realm of political consensus, the accuracy of one's observations is inversely proportional to one's immunity from consequences. The first assault came through a mechanism that would become characteristic of what would later be termed the military-industrial political complex, the controlled narrative. Patton's command of the Third Army had been the subject of extensive press coverage, but this coverage had followed a carefully constructed script. He was presented as a warrior, aggressive, bold, brilliant, but always within acceptable parameters. When he began to articulate concerns about Soviet expansion, however, the narrative shifted with surgical precision. Suddenly, the same aggressiveness that had been celebrated as military genius was recharacterized as insubordination. The boldness became recklessness. The clarity of vision transformed into ideological obsession. This was not accidental. The State Department and elements within the Joint Chiefs of Staff had already determined that Patton's public statements regarding Soviet intentions were becoming a political liability. What makes Patton's case particularly instructive for understanding how power structures eliminate inconvenient voices is the subtlety of the campaign against him. He was not court-martialed. He was not explicitly forbidden from speaking. Instead, he was subjected to a more insidious form of institutional violence. He was slowly, methodically humiliated and marginalized within the very structure that had elevated him to prominence. His recommendations regarding military strategy were increasingly ignored. His authority over his own command was systematically diminished. Officers who had once sought his counsel began to distance themselves, not out of disagreement, but out of simple self-preservation. The message was clear, though never explicitly stated. Those who aligned themselves with Patton's analysis of Soviet intentions would themselves become targets of institutional disapproval. The critical moment arrived when Patton committed what would prove to be his ultimate transgression. He spoke to the press with a candor that transcended the careful boundaries that had been established. In interviews and public remarks, he articulated with unmistakable clarity his assessment that the Soviet Union represented an existential threat to American interests, that Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe constituted a new form of imperial conquest, and that American military policy was being shaped by individuals who either did not understand Soviet intentions or were actively complicit in Soviet expansion. These were not the ravings of a paranoid militarist. They were, in fact, positions that would be vindicated by the subsequent Cold War and by the opening of Soviet archives decades later. But in the summer of 1945, such statements violated the fundamental consensus that governed American foreign policy. The response was swift and devastating in its bureaucratic precision. Patton was reassigned. The justification provided was ostensibly administrative. His services were no longer required in the occupation of Germany. His command would be transferred. He would be given a position of lesser strategic significance. But everyone understood what was actually occurring. Patton was being removed from any position where his voice might carry weight, where his military authority might influence policy, where his observations about Soviet intentions might reach audiences capable of acting upon them. The man who had engineered some of the most audacious military victories of the European theater was being relegated to administrative obscurity. What is particularly revealing about this moment is that no one openly acknowledged the real reason for Patton's removal. Instead, a series of ostensible justifications were constructed, each technically defensible, but collectively constituting a transparent message.
The political establishment had decided that Patton's continued prominence represented an unacceptable risk to the post-war order. His crime was not disloyalty to his nation, it was disloyalty to the consensus regarding how his nation should relate to its new geopolitical reality. He had refused to accept the fundamental contradiction at the heart of American post-war strategy, the maintenance of an alliance with a totalitarian power whose interests were fundamentally incompatible with American interests, and for this refusal, he would be systematically destroyed, his voice marginalized, his warnings dismissed as the paranoid ravings of a warmonger who could not accept the necessity of compromise with Soviet ambitions. The tragedy, the true historical tragedy, was that Patton was not wrong. The institutional machinery that silenced him was built upon a false premise, a dangerous illusion that Soviet leaders could be trusted as partners in a shared post-war vision. Within 5 years, the fiction would collapse. The Soviet threat would become so obvious that even the most committed defenders of Soviet cooperation would be forced to acknowledge it. But by then, Patton's voice had been neutralized, his warnings had been discredited through the simple mechanism of institutional disapproval, and the architecture of his destruction had already begun to unfold towards its inexorable conclusion.
By December 1945, 7 months after the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany, George Patton had been reduced to a vestigial figure within the military hierarchy he had once dominated. His command had been progressively diminished. His public statements had been met with increasingly severe administrative rebukes. The machinery of institutional repression, having discovered that direct suppression only amplified Patton's defiant public presence, had shifted toward a strategy of complete isolation. He was given nominal authority over skeletal administrative functions, reviewing occupation policies, managing the orderly demobilization of troops, tasks designed with meticulous care to consume his time while granting him no genuine influence over strategic matters. It was a form of slow asphyxiation, a bureaucratic strangulation designed to break the will of a man who had spent his entire life commanding armies and shaping events. Patton, however, remained psychologically unconquered. Despite the systematic erosion of his authority and the near-universal coldness of political establishments in Washington, he continued to articulate his convictions through the only channels remaining available to him: private correspondence, interviews with selected journalists, and conversations with officers who still maintained enough professional loyalty to listen to his assessments. What emerges from the historical record is a portrait of a man in profound psychological distress, not from fear of professional consequences, which had already been largely inflicted, but from the recognition that the political establishment was knowingly pursuing a strategy that he believed would result in catastrophic consequences for American security. His journal entries from this period reveal a mind oscillating between righteous indignation and something approaching despair, the despair of a man who possesses knowledge that those in power refuse to acknowledge, whose warnings are dismissed not because they lack merit, but because they threaten the comfortable consensual narratives that justify the decisions already made. On December 9, 1945, Patton was traveling through the countryside near Mannheim, Germany, in an official automobile. The circumstances of what occurred next have never been entirely clarified, though the official narrative, a collision with an American truck, injuries sustained that proved ultimately fatal, has persisted unchallenged through the decades. Patton died 13 days later, on December 21, 1945, from complications of his injuries. What is notable about this event, and what has generated considerable historical speculation, is not necessarily what occurred, but rather the profound convenience of its timing and the complete absence of the kind of rigorous investigation that would typically accompany the death of a five-star general who had been a prominent public figure and a source of significant political friction. The mechanics of institutional power occasionally manifest in ways that are indirect, deniable, and therefore infinitely more effective than explicit violence. Whether Patton's death was accident, negligence, or something more deliberately orchestrated remains, and will likely remain, unknowable. What is unambiguous is that his death occurred at a moment when his continued public presence represented an increasingly intolerable threat to the post-war consensus. He was a general officer with significant credibility, a man whose military accomplishments were beyond dispute, and a figure who refused to accept the official narrative regarding Soviet intentions. The political establishment faced a genuine dilemma. Patton could not be silenced through administrative measures. He possessed sufficient rank and public prominence to make such efforts appear authoritarian and potentially counterproductive. Yet allowing him to continue speaking represented an unacceptable risk to the fundamental consensus upon which post-war planning rested. What makes Patton's death particularly instructive is how completely it resolved this dilemma.
His voice was silenced not through explicit censorship but through permanent cessation. The machinery of power, having exhausted the subtler mechanisms of institutional suppression, achieved through his death what could not be achieved through any other means: the complete elimination of a voice that refused to accept comfortable lies. The subsequent management of Patton's legacy was executed with remarkable bureaucratic efficiency. His warnings regarding Soviet intentions were carefully minimized in official histories. His prescient analyses were recharacterized as paranoid obsessions of a man whose judgment had been corrupted by militarism and an inability to accept the new realities of the post-war world. The narrative that emerged was one in which Patton was remembered as a brilliant but flawed warrior, brave, decisive, but ultimately dangerous because he could not accept the necessity of compromise with Soviet power. The tragic irony, of course, is that within less than 5 years, the fundamental correctness of Patton's analysis would become impossible to deny. The Soviet Union's expansionist ambitions, which he had clearly articulated in 1945, would manifest with such obvious ferocity that even the most committed defenders of Soviet cooperation would be forced to acknowledge the reality of Soviet imperialism. The Cold War would validate nearly every assessment that Patton had made regarding Soviet intentions, Soviet strategy, and the inevitable trajectory of conflict between American and Soviet interests. But by then, Patton was dead, his voice permanently silenced, his warnings relegated to historical footnotes, and the embarrassed acknowledgments of those who had dismissed him. The machinery had achieved its objective with perfect efficiency. It had eliminated the voice, discredited the message, and ensured that when the truth of Patton's predictions became undeniable, there would be no living advocate capable of saying, with the weight of his authority and experience, "I told you so."
History, when observed from sufficient distance, reveals itself as a series of moments in which power structures demonstrate their capacity to resist truth until the resistance becomes physically impossible. The Cold War, that protracted ideological and military confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union that would dominate the latter half of the 20th century, was not an unforeseen development that caught American policymakers by surprise. It was rather the inevitable manifestation of precisely the scenarios that Patton had articulated with remarkable prescience in 1945. The Eastern European territories that he had warned would fall under Soviet dominion were systematically absorbed into the Soviet sphere of influence. The Soviet leadership, far from being the cooperative partner envisioned by Roosevelt and his successors, pursued an agenda of systematic imperial expansion that mirrored the territorial ambitions of the Nazi regime that had just been defeated. The nuclear weapons that Patton had identified as a critical concern in Soviet hands became the defining existential threat of the era. What makes this vindication of Patton's analysis particularly significant is that it came too late to matter. By the time American policymakers were forced to acknowledge the reality of Soviet expansionism, Patton had been dead for years, his voice permanently silenced, his warnings relegated to the status of historical curiosities rather than prescient analysis. The opportunity to act on his warnings at the moment when American military superiority was absolute, when Soviet forces were exhausted from their war with Nazi Germany, and when the reconstruction of Eastern Europe remained theoretically possible, had been irretrievably lost. The consensus that had been constructed to silence Patton's voice had also simultaneously prevented the American strategic apparatus from responding with the force and clarity that the situation demanded. By 1947, when American policymakers finally began to acknowledge the reality of Soviet intentions, the strategic landscape had shifted dramatically. Soviet forces occupied Eastern Europe, the Iron Curtain had descended, the world had been divided into competing spheres of influence, and the machinery of institutional consensus that had silenced Patton had achieved through that silencing a geopolitical outcome that he had desperately attempted to prevent. The posthumous rehabilitation of Patton's reputation proceeded along a carefully controlled trajectory. He was restored to the status of military hero, celebrated for his tactical brilliance and his role in the defeat of Nazi Germany. His warnings about Soviet intentions were occasionally acknowledged, but always within a framework that minimized their significance. He was portrayed as a man whose military judgment was sound within his proper domain, but whose venture into political assessment had been marked by the paranoia and ideological rigidity characteristic of a warrior incapable of understanding diplomatic nuance. This narrative served multiple functions simultaneously. It allowed the post-war political establishment to acknowledge Patton's prescience without explicitly admitting that they had been catastrophically wrong in dismissing his warnings. It provided a framework for explaining why his advice had been ignored, and it ensured that future military figures would understand the consequences of challenging the consensus of civilian political leadership. What is particularly revealing is how the institutions that had destroyed Patton systematically prevented any genuine examination of the mechanisms by which his voice had been marginalized and ultimately silenced.
The historical record, the contemporaneous documents, the decisions made in the State Department, the conversations among military leadership regarding how to neutralize Patton's influence remained largely inaccessible to serious scholarly inquiry for decades. When these materials were eventually released, often through the Freedom of Information Act or through the retirement of the officials involved, they revealed with unmistakable clarity that Patton's removal from positions of authority had been driven not by legitimate strategic disagreements, but by the determination of the political establishment to silence a voice that contradicted the official narrative regarding post-war cooperation with the Soviet Union. The legacy of Patton's destruction extends far beyond the historical assessment of a single military figure. It represents a case study in how power structures eliminate inconvenient voices, how consensus is constructed and enforced, and how institutions protect themselves from information that threatens their foundational assumptions. Patton was not destroyed because he was wrong. He was destroyed precisely because he was right, and his rightness threatened the consensual order that had been established by those in power. The machinery that silenced him operated through institutional mechanisms that left no explicit fingerprints, that created plausible deniability at every stage, and that transformed his marginalization into a narrative of bureaucratic necessity rather than political suppression. In the final analysis, Patton's destruction represents something far more tragic than the elimination of a single voice, however prominent that voice may have been. It represents the triumph of institutional consensus over empirical reality, the victory of comfortable lies over difficult truths, and the demonstration that even a figure possessed of extraordinary credibility, military authority, and clarity of analysis can be systematically neutralized by a power structure determined to protect its preferred narratives. In the final analysis, Patton's destruction represents something far more tragic than the elimination of a single voice, however prominent that voice may have been. It represents the triumph of institutional consensus over empirical reality, the victory of comfortable lies over difficult truths, and the demonstration that even a figure possessed of extraordinary credibility, military authority, and clarity of analysis can be systematically neutralized by a power structure determined to protect its preferred narratives. In the final analysis, Patton's destruction represents something far more tragic than the elimination of a single voice, however prominent that voice may have been. It represents the triumph of institutional consensus over empirical reality, the victory of comfortable lies over difficult truths, and the demonstration that even a figure possessed of extraordinary credibility, military authority, and clarity of analysis can be systematically neutralized by a power structure determined to protect its preferred narratives. In the final analysis, Patton's destruction represents something far more tragic than the elimination of a single voice, however prominent that voice may have been. It represents the triumph of institutional consensus over empirical reality, the victory of comfortable lies over difficult truths, and the demonstration that even a figure possessed of extraordinary credibility, military authority, and clarity of analysis can be systematically neutralized by a power structure determined to protect its preferred narratives. In the final analysis, Patton's destruction represents something far more tragic than the elimination of a single voice, however prominent that voice may have been. It represents the triumph of institutional consensus over empirical reality, the victory of comfortable lies over difficult truths, and the demonstration that even a figure possessed of extraordinary credibility, military authority, and clarity of analysis can be systematically neutralized by a power structure determined to protect its preferred narratives. In the final analysis, Patton's destruction represents something far more tragic than the elimination of a single voice, however prominent that voice may have been. It represents the triumph of institutional consensus over empirical reality, the victory of comfortable lies over difficult truths, and the demonstration that even a figure possessed of extraordinary credibility, military authority, and clarity of analysis can be systematically neutralized by a power structure determined to protect its preferred narratives. In the final analysis, Patton's destruction represents something far more tragic than the elimination of a single voice, however prominent that voice may have been.